Miss Marple and Murder in the Siren's Locket. Chapter 1. A Summer Gathering at Rosehill. The village of Rosehill was the sort of place one might sketch from memory of an ideal English countryside. Neat cottages with climbing roses leaned companionably against one another, their tiled roofs dipped and weathered by time. The high street had just the essentials: a grocer, a post office, and Mrs. Elwood's bakery, from which the smell of warm bread drifted out each morning. In Rosehill, news traveled faster than the milk cart, and secrets, if secrets there were, seldom stayed hidden long. That summer had brought an unusual brightness, the sort that made even the oldest villagers remark on how the roses seemed redder and the air lighter than in years past. It was on one such afternoon that the annual garden fete at Rosehill Manor was to be held, a tradition that gathered every villager in one way or another. Lady Agnes Farnaby, who presided over the manor with a sharp tongue and a keen sense of what was proper, had arranged the fete with her usual efficiency. There were stalls for jam, embroidery, and bric-a-brac, a raffle in aid of the church roof, and most importantly, the unveiling of what she proudly termed a treasure from the Farnaby collection. Rumor had it that this treasure was a piece of jewelry, a locket of curious design, shaped like a seashell with a delicate engraving of a siren along its silver surface. It had been, Lady Agnes confided to several listeners in confidence, which of course meant the entire village knew within hours, a gift from some naval ancestor long since departed. By 3 o'clock, the lawns of Rosehill Manor were dotted with villagers in their summer best. Children chased one another between the marquees, women compared sponge cakes and chutneys, and the men congregated near the ale tent. The whole scene was cheerfully English, as though nothing ill could ever disturb such order. It was among the crowd, though not quite of it, that Miss Marple could be seen. She sat in a wicker chair slightly apart from the others, knitting needles clicking with gentle persistence. She was not a central figure at such gatherings. Indeed, many considered her a quiet presence, useful for conversation when one was between acquaintances. Yet those who dismissed her as merely a kindly old lady with a fondness for wool were gravely mistaken. "Such weather for the fete!" exclaimed Mrs. Bantry, bustling over with a paper plate of scones. "I do say, Jane, I can't remember a summer so fine. Of course, it's bound to rain tomorrow now." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes following a cluster of villagers near the raffle table. "The English climate does enjoy its little surprises, Dolly. But we mustn't grumble. This is perfect weather for such an event." It was then that Lady Agnes appeared upon the dais erected before the manor steps. A hush settled as she held aloft the locket, which gleamed under the sunlight. Its silver surface seemed almost to ripple, and the engraving of the siren caught the light in a most peculiar way. "A family heirloom," Lady Agnes declared proudly. "The Siren's Locket. Quite unique, quite valuable, and never before displayed in Rosehill. My great-great-grandfather, Admiral Farnaby, is said to have won it in Naples after some gallant adventure." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Elwood whispered that it must be worth a small fortune. Mr. Trelawney, the churchwarden, muttered something about it being improper to flaunt wealth when the church roof was leaking. And the younger villagers, especially the visiting niece of Lady Agnes, a striking girl named Clara, watched the locket with undisguised fascination. Miss Marple, her knitting paused, observed quietly. There was admiration, yes, but also envy, suspicion, and even resentment passing across faces in that crowd. She had seen such looks before, though few others would have noticed. By the close of the afternoon, the fete began to wind down. Villagers drifted home with baskets of preserves and second-hand novels, the raffle prizes collected, the beer casks drained. Yet among the cheerful chatter lingered the memory of the locket, its gleam, its promise of history and wealth. When twilight fell, the lawns emptied and Rosehill Manor stood quiet once more. But within its grand halls, preparations were made to lock the locket away in Lady Agnes's study cabinet. A precaution, she said, for one could never be too careful with treasure. And so it might have ended. Just another summer fete, just another piece of gossip for the villagers to discuss. But in Rosehill, as Miss Marple well knew, the simplest gatherings often concealed darker currents. And by dawn, before the dew had dried on the roses, a crime would shake the village to its very heart. Chapter 2. Whispers on the Lawn. The fete at Rosehill Manor did not end quickly. English village events never did. Even after the raffle had been drawn and the last sponge cake judged, people lingered in little knots across the lawns, reluctant to leave the warmth of the day and the company of their neighbors. Near the croquet lawn, a group of ladies stood beneath a striped tent where cups of weak tea and slightly stale cucumber sandwiches were being offered. Mrs. Elwood, wiping her brow with a handkerchief, leaned in close to Mrs. Bantry and lowered her voice. "Quite a piece of silver, that locket," she said. "Lady Agnes must be sitting on a fortune. Funny she's never shown it before. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?" Mrs. Bantry raised her eyebrows in her usual expressive way. Agnes Farnaby's always had her secrets. But if you ask me, showing it off was a mistake. Nothing good comes of parading wealth in front of people. The third woman, Mrs. Webb, who prided herself on being the most respectable in Rosehill, pursed her lips. "It's not envy, mind you. I'd never stoop to that. But I did notice young Clara staring at it as though she might swallow it whole. That girl has ambition written all over her." From her wicker chair not far away, Miss Marple appeared to be absorbed in her knitting. The soft click of her needles, steady and unhurried, might have convinced anyone she had not heard a word. Yet her pale blue eyes, half hidden behind her spectacles, missed nothing. She noted the envy in Mrs. Elwood's tone, the faint disapproval in Mrs. Webb's, and the caution in Dolly Bantry's. Gossip, in Miss Marple's quiet experience, was often more revealing than testimony under oath. At the other end of the lawn, near the beer tent, men were engaged in their own version of speculation. "Fine bit of silver," muttered Mr. Trelawney, the churchwarden, to Mr. Hargreaves, the grocer. "And meanwhile we've buckets in the nave catching rainwater every Sunday. Priorities, that's what I say." Hargreaves chuckled. "Don't let Lady Agnes hear you, old man. She'd sooner let the whole roof cave in than part with that trinket. Proud as Lucifer, that one." Nearby, the local constable, Sergeant Willis, was enjoying a pint. His ruddy face shone with good cheer as he declared, "Well, nobody's going to steal it here, not with the whole village watching. Safe as houses, I'd say." Miss Marple, still knitting, smiled faintly at this remark. Safe as houses, she thought. A comforting phrase, but how often had she known it to prove untrue? The younger villagers were gathered by the tennis court, talking in voices just loud enough to be overheard. Clara Farnaby, Lady Agnes's niece, stood at the center of attention. She was handsome, with dark eyes and an almost theatrical manner. "I told Aunt Agnes she ought to lend it to a museum," Clara said dramatically, tossing her hair back. "It's wasted in some dusty old cabinet. Things like that are meant to be seen." "Or sold," suggested Henry Elwood, the baker's son, with a mischievous grin. Clara gave him a sharp look, then laughed as though he had made a harmless joke. But the laughter did not reach her eyes. Miss Marple, rising carefully from her chair, strolled toward the refreshment table. Dolly Bantry followed, linking her arm through her friend's. "Now tell me, Jane," Dolly whispered, "did you see the way Clara looked at that locket? As though she'd already written her name on it. I don't blame her, poor girl. Agnes keeps her on the thinnest of allowances. Still, I wouldn't put it past her to— oh heavens, what a dreadful thought." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her knitting tucked neatly under one arm. "My dear Dolly," she said gently, "it's very seldom the obvious thing that turns out to be true, but one does notice the way people look at objects they covet. It is human nature, after all." The two women reached the table where Lady Agnes herself was presiding, a thin smile fixed on her lips as she oversaw the last of the cakes being sold. The locket, having been displayed so proudly earlier, was now gone from view, locked, no doubt, in some drawer or cabinet within the house. "Ah, Jane, Mrs. Bantry." Lady Agnes greeted them with a regal nod. "I trust you've enjoyed the fete. A most satisfactory turnout this year. Though I must say," her voice dropped a fraction, "the way people stare at a simple family heirloom. Really, one would think they had never seen silver before. Vulgar curiosity, I call it." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "It was very kind of you to share it with us, Lady Agnes. A glimpse of history can be most illuminating." Lady Agnes gave her a sharp look, uncertain whether the remark was meant kindly or critically. Before she could reply, a maid hurried up to whisper something in her ear. Agnes's expression tightened. "Excuse me," she said shortly, and swept off toward the house, leaving behind a trail of speculation. "Trouble in the manor already," muttered Mrs. Elwood, watching her go. "Mark my words, that locket will bring no good." The shadows lengthened across the lawn as the fete at last wound down. Villagers drifted homeward with baskets and gossip, their minds full of silver and secrets. Miss Marple walked slowly with Dolly Bantry, pausing once to glance back at the manor. The great house loomed in the twilight, its windows beginning to glow with lamplight. "Strange, isn't it?" Dolly said, her voice quieter now. "Such a peaceful day, and yet, well, one feels something in the air. You know what I mean." Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Yes, Dolly, I do know. People are very much like weather after all. A day may seem clear and calm, and yet clouds gather unseen. One must simply wait to see when the storm breaks." And as they walked on toward the village, the first bats flickering above the hedgerows, Miss Marple felt with that deep instinct of hers that Rosehill was standing on the edge of something dark, something that would shatter its peace before many hours had passed. Chapter 3. A Disturbance in the Night. The fate at Rosehill Manor left behind it the kind of hushed quiet that always follows a day of noise and laughter. By dusk, the lawns were empty, the marquees taken down, and only a scattering of paper cups and trampled grass bore witness to the crowds that had filled the place only hours earlier. Inside the manor, the household settled into its evening routine. Lady Agnes, weary from her duties as hostess, dined early with Clara and retired soon after, declaring she would lock the Siren's locket away in the cabinet in her study. Clara had argued, lightly, almost teasingly, that she ought to be allowed to wear it at least once, but Lady Agnes's eyes had narrowed. "Family heirlooms," she said coldly, "are not trinkets to be paraded about by frivolous girls. They require dignity." Clara had flushed crimson, biting back a retort. By 10 o'clock, the house was quiet. Lamps glowed in a few upper windows. The servants moved softly about their final duties. The kitchen clattered briefly before settling into silence. A heavy stillness descended upon Rosehill. Even the village beyond the gates seemed hushed, as though holding its breath after the gaiety of the day. It was near midnight when the first sign of disturbance came. Mrs. Finch, Lady Agnes's long-serving housekeeper, later swore she had been woken by the sound of something. Perhaps a door closing too firmly, or a hurried step in the corridor. She lit her candle and listened, but the manor had fallen back into silence. She told herself it was the wind, though the night outside was still and warm. Yet she did not sleep again for some time. Half an hour later, the peace of Rosehill was broken by a sound that carried further than the manor walls. A scream. It was sharp, sudden, and chilling. Villagers closest to the estate, Mr. Hargreaves the grocer, Mrs. Webb in her neat little house by the lane, sat bolt upright in their beds, listening with thudding hearts. Some claimed afterward it was the voice of a woman. Others insisted it was a man's cry of terror. But all agreed it cut the summer night like a knife. At the manor, servants rushed from their rooms, clutching dressing gowns and lamps. Clara, pale in her nightdress, stumbled from her bedroom, eyes wide with fear. "It came from downstairs," she gasped. Together they hurried toward the study, where Lady Agnes had last been seen. The heavy oak door stood ajar. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of extinguished candle wax. On the desk, papers were scattered as if brushed aside in haste. The glass-fronted cabinet in the corner stood open, its shelves empty where the locket had rested. But it was not the absence of the locket that made Clara scream a second time. On the carpet before the hearth lay the still body of Mr. Collins, Lady Agnes's elderly butler. His head was turned at an unnatural angle, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling. The faint glimmer of blood at his temple told its own tale. Lady Agnes herself was nowhere to be seen. For a few stunned seconds, no one moved. The ticking of the mantel clock sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. Then Mrs. Finch began to sob, one of the maids fainted, and Clara clutched the doorframe as though she might collapse. It was Sergeant Willis, roused from his bed and summoned by a breathless footman, who took charge. Puffing with indignation and alarm, he pushed through the gathering crowd and stood grimly over the butler's body. "Good Lord," he muttered. Murder, no doubt of it. And the locket gone. He turned to the servants, his face grave. Nobody leaves this house. I'll have word sent to Inspector Craythorne at once. Up in the village, lights flickered to life in cottage windows as the news spread like wildfire. People whispered from doorstep to doorstep. Murder at the manor, the butler dead, the locket stolen. Some spoke of burglars, others of jealous quarrels. And already, beneath the shock, suspicion began to curl like smoke. Miss Marple, in her neat little house on the edge of the green, had also been woken by the scream. She rose quietly, lit her lamp, and sat by her window, looking out across the village roofs toward the dark silhouette of Rosehill Manor. Her knitting lay in her lap, forgotten for once. Murder, she said softly to herself, the word sounding strange in the stillness of her room. Yes, one can feel it. And as she sat there, calm but deeply thoughtful, she knew that the storm she had sensed on the lawn that afternoon had indeed broken. Rosehill, with all its roses and gossip and secrets, was about to reveal a much darker side. Chapter 4. The Shocking Discovery. The study at Rosehill Manor, normally a place of order and routine, was in chaos. The open cabinet, the scattered papers, the fallen butler, these were not sights the household could easily comprehend. The servants huddled together near the door, whispering and weeping, while Clara remained frozen. One hand pressed to her mouth, her dark eyes wide with horror. Sergeant Willis, puffing and red-faced, attempted to assert some semblance of authority. He crouched beside the body, frowned, then straightened up with a grunt. Head wound, he said gravely. Blunt instrument, most like. Death was quick, I'd say. And this cabinet, emptied. Well, it's plain enough. A thief broke in, got caught by Collins here, struck him down, and ran off with the locket. Clara gave a little cry. But Aunt Agnes, where is she? She must have heard something. Why isn't she here? Mrs. Finch dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Her ladyship retired early, miss. I went to her room myself with her cocoa. Oh, mercy, what if she's... The words faltered, but the implication hung heavy in the room. Sergeant Willis cleared his throat. Now then, no need to panic. We'll have her ladyship found safe and sound, I'm sure. Collins here must have stumbled on the thief, that's all. Simple business. Simple business. Yet as the words echoed in the dimly lit study, they rang hollow. Nothing about the still figure on the carpet or the vanished locket felt simple. By the time Inspector Craythorne arrived from the market town 2 miles off, the household was in a state of nervous collapse. Craythorne was a tall, sharp-featured man with a manner both brisk and authoritative. He surveyed the scene with cool detachment, nodding curtly as Willis delivered his theory. Burglary, sir. Locket's gone. Butler tried to stop him. Fatal blow. That's it, I'd say. Craythorne's eyes narrowed. Perhaps. But burglars don't often scream in the night. Someone heard it, I think. Several servants nodded. Clara stepped forward. I did. I was woken by it. It was dreadful. Like nothing human. The inspector looked at her sharply, then turned to the body again. We'll not leap to conclusions, Sergeant. Have the grounds searched. No one leaves this house until I say so. And someone fetch Lady Agnes Farnaby at once. But Lady Agnes, when found, was not dead as some had feared. She was in her bedroom, pale and trembling, sitting upright in bed as though she had been waiting. She admitted hearing raised voices and a crash, but fear had kept her from leaving her room. I locked the door, she confessed, hands twisting nervously in her lap. I thought they might come for me. And the locket, my family's locket, gone. Her voice broke, but whether from grief for her servant or loss of the jewel, it was hard to say. Back in the study, the inspector questioned the household one by one. The footman swore he had been asleep. The maid insisted she had seen nothing. Clara declared she had been in bed, though her flushed cheeks and evasive answers suggested she knew more than she told. Miss Marple arrived quietly just as the questioning was ending. Dolly Bantry had insisted on accompanying her, explaining to the constable at the gate that Miss Marple's wisdom was worth more than half the force put together. Standing in the doorway, small and unassuming, Miss Marple's sharp eyes moved over the room. She noted the way Collins's hand was clenched as though he had tried to grasp something. She observed the cabinet's lock, forced not with violence but with delicate precision. And she listened, above all she listened, to the words spoken and unspoken in the charged silence. Craythorne, though polite, clearly dismissed her presence. "Ladies, this is not a spectacle for onlookers. There's been a most serious crime." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed gently. "A very serious one. And yet—" She glanced at the body, her voice no louder than a murmur. "One can't help noticing how very inconveniently placed this all is. Collins, of course, was loyal. But loyalty, Inspector, can sometimes place one in danger. Not from strangers, but from those one trusts." Craythorne frowned, half irritated, half intrigued. "What are you implying, madam?" "Oh, nothing at all," Miss Marple said innocently, her knitting bag folded neatly in her hands. "Merely an observation. One learns a good deal from living in villages, Inspector. People are so very alike, you know, everywhere. The patterns repeat themselves." The inspector, unimpressed, turned back to his notes. But Clara, standing near the window, had gone very still, her lips pressed tightly together. As dawn crept pale across the sky, the first rumors spread through Rosehill like wildfire. The butler murdered. The locket stolen. Lady Agnes nearly attacked. Some swore the killer must have been an outsider, a thief from the neighboring town. Others muttered darkly about old grudges, about greed, about the Farnaby fortune. Miss Marple, walking home in the cool morning air, listened to the fragments of talk drifting from cottage doorways. She made no comment, but in her mind she turned over the facts: the scream, the careful lock on the cabinet, the missing locket, the dead butler. And above all, the faces she had seen in the study, the grief, the fear, the guilt that flickered unguarded for an instant before being hidden away. "Not burglary," she murmured softly to herself. "No, no. Something very much more personal." Chapter 5. The police arrive. By morning, Rosehill Manor looked less like a stately home and more like the headquarters of a siege. Constables moved about the grounds, their boots damp with dew, checking every gate and hedge. A police motor car stood outside the main entrance, its presence both reassuring and deeply unsettling to the villagers who gathered in little knots at the lane, craning for a glimpse of activity. Inspector Craythorne had wasted no time establishing authority. He sat now in Lady Agnes's study. Though the body of poor Collins had been respectfully removed, the room still bore the heavy scent of tragedy. The inspector's notebook lay open before him, and his voice carried with clipped precision as he dictated instructions to Sergeant Willis. Search of the grounds must be thorough. Every shed, every hedge, every possible hiding place. Word to be sent to all pawnbrokers within 30 miles regarding a silver locket of unusual design. We shall assume, for now, burglary with fatal consequence. Sergeant Willis scribbled industriously, nodding. He looked positively relieved to have a theory so clear, so simple. Lady Agnes, seated stiffly in a high-backed chair, bristled with indignation. "Burglary, Inspector? Rosehill has never had such a thing. It is unthinkable that ruffians from outside should invade my house." Craythorne inclined his head, not unkindly. "It is rare, Lady Farnaby, but valuables on display do tempt the wrong sort. You had many visitors yesterday. A thief may have slipped in unnoticed." Lady Agnes's lips thinned to a white line. Clara, standing near the window, let out a bitter laugh. "Or perhaps," she said, "one needn't look beyond these very walls. Thieves aren't always strangers." The words fell into the room like a stone into water. Lady Agnes turned a cold glare upon her niece. "Do not speak in riddles, Clara. If you have something to say it plainly." Clara shrugged, but her eyes glittered. "Only that loyalty isn't the same as honesty. Collins may not have been the paragon you thought." Inspector Craythorne tapped his pen. "Enough. The butler was a victim, not a culprit. We must remain clear-headed." Miss Marple, who had slipped quietly into the study with Mrs. Bantry, listened without interruption. Dolly, ever brimming with indignation, leaned close to whisper. "Imagine Clara saying such a thing about the dead. Heartless, if you ask me." Miss Marple gave the smallest nod, her gaze resting thoughtfully on the young woman's profile. "Yes, Dolly. It is often revealing to see who casts suspicion first." The inspector continued briskly with his questioning. Each servant was summoned again, each account written down. Yet the statements, though neat on paper, lacked conviction. A maid insisted she had been in bed all night, though her trembling voice betrayed fear of something more. The footman claimed to have heard nothing, yet Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes darted toward Clara when he spoke. Afterwards, the inspector addressed the gathered household. "Until further notice, none of you are to leave Rosehill. We shall need to verify all accounts. Constables will remain posted at the gates." Gasps of dismay rose among the servants. Clara rolled her eyes dramatically. "Prisoners in our own house. How perfectly dreadful." Lady Agnes, however, gave a sharp nod. "It is necessary. Whoever did this will be found." As the formalities wound down, Miss Marple wandered toward the cabinet where the locket had once rested. The lock, she noted again, was not splintered or smashed, but tampered with delicately. Not the work of a panicked thief, but of someone who knew what they were about. Her fingers hovered over the edge of the wood, where a faint smudge of wax suggested a candle had been burned very close. She said nothing but tucked the detail away. Out in the village, speculation grew fiercer by the hour. At Mrs. Elwood's bakery, customers queued not only for bread but for news. "They say it was a London gang," Mrs. Webb declared, buying her loaf. "Professional work, they call it. Came in with a motor car, struck the poor butler down, and vanished before anyone could blink." "Nonsense," retorted Mr. Trelawney, standing behind her. "No gangs in Rosehill. This was someone local. Mark my words, there'll be secrets in that manner none of us ever guessed." Even children whispered about the Siren's Locket, their imaginations inflamed by tales of curses and hidden treasures. The peaceful rhythm of Rosehill had been shattered, replaced with feverish suspicion. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Dolly Bantry perched opposite, brimming with theories. "It must have been some dreadful outsider, Jane. Surely none of our villagers would stoop to murder. Collins was a dear man. And the way that Clara spoke, well, I do declare, I wouldn't put it past her to know more than she lets on." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Perhaps, Dolly. But one mustn't jump too quickly. You see, when there is a theft, people tend to think first of the object itself. Yet human beings do not kill for silver alone. They kill for pride, for shame, for love, and sometimes for reasons much smaller, yet far more dangerous." Dolly frowned, baffled. "But what are you saying, Jane?" Miss Marple gave her mildest smile. "Only that burglars rarely scream in the night, my dear. And what we heard last night was not the sound of a stranger's crime, but of someone, much closer to home." Chapter 6. Miss Marple Listens. Morning sunlight slanted through the windows of the Rosehill post office, catching on rows of polished brass letter slots. Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, moved with purposeful bustle behind the counter, but her eyes gleamed with suppressed excitement. A murder in Rosehill was like manna from heaven for a woman who thrived on tidings. Miss Marple, with her usual air of mild distraction, stepped forward to purchase a packet of stamps. She chose the slower queue deliberately. One learns far more when people think you are simply taking your time. "And they say Lady Agnes fainted clean away," Mrs. Elwood from the bakery was telling her neighbor. "Carried her to her room, smelling salts and all. Can't say I blame her." Her neighbor sniffed. "All well and good, but I heard she had words with Collins only yesterday. Something to do with household accounts. He was a stickler for order, that man, and Lady Agnes isn't always precise." Miss Marple glanced mildly at her knitting bag, as if wool were her only concern. But inwardly she tucked the remark away. Collins quarreling with Lady Agnes. That was not a detail Inspector Craythorne had mentioned. When at last her stamps were handed over, Miss Marple lingered just a fraction longer, remarking pleasantly on the fine weather. It was enough. People eager to share filled the silence themselves. By the time she left the shop, she had gathered 3 small but curious facts. Collins had been seen pacing the lane after dusk the evening before his death. A light had burned unusually late in Clara's upstairs window, and young Fred Dyer, the gardener, had gone missing from his quarters for nearly an hour during the crucial time. None of it conclusive. Yet to Miss Marple's mind, it was the pattern that mattered, the faint stitching of human behavior. Later that afternoon she took tea with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Anstruther. The vicarage parlor smelled faintly of polish and lavender, and a plate of currant scones sat temptingly on the tray. Mrs. Anstruther, never one to resist a confidence, leaned forward at once. "It's a dreadful business, Miss Marple. Truly dreadful. I cannot help thinking of poor Collins's soul. And yet, if I may speak freely, there are things one notices in a parish that never reach the inspector's ears." Miss Marple encouraged her with a gentle "indeed." Mrs. Anstruther lowered her voice. "That young Clara. She is restless, unsettled. More than once she has slipped into the vestry unaccompanied, and I fear she has written letters she would not wish Lady Agnes to see. I should not mention it, but, well, the company one keeps, you know." Miss Marple nodded, not in judgment but in quiet understanding. Clara's rebellion, her late-night letters, her sharp tongue, these were not meaningless outbursts but threads leading somewhere. When evening fell, Miss Marple walked slowly back through the village. The lamps were being lit one by one, the shadows lengthening. She passed the green where children still played, though their mothers called them home earlier now, fearful of dark corners. She paused by the manor gates, watching the constable on duty stamping his feet against the chill. "Cold work, constable," she remarked kindly. The young man smiled ruefully. "Aye, ma'am. But orders is orders. Inspector reckons the murderer might try to slip away. Though between you and me I think it were an inside job. Doors locked from within, no marks of breaking." Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile and moved on, satisfied. Even among the constables, doubts had begun to stir. Back in her sitting room at St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple settled into her chair. The fire flickered low, her knitting needles clicked, and her thoughts moved with the same quiet rhythm. Others looked for bold strokes. Burglars, gangs, dramatic villains. But Jane Marple knew that evil often wears a familiar face, hidden behind gossip, duty, or even affection. And in Rosehill, faces were many, and none were telling quite the whole truth. Chapter 7: Suspicions and Shadows. Rosehill Manor, usually so still and stately, had become a house of whispers. Servants moved about with hushed footsteps, their eyes darting nervously at every sound. Doors seemed to close too softly, conversations broke off too quickly, and in every corridor there lingered a faint, oppressive silence, as though the walls themselves disapproved of harboring a secret. Clara Farnaby was the only one who seemed impervious to the gloom. That morning she descended to breakfast in a gown of striking green satin, her laughter echoing far too brightly for the somber occasion. "Really, Aunt," she drawled, spearing a slice of toast, "must we all behave as though the sky had fallen? Collins was very devoted, yes, but the man is gone. What good does it do wringing our hands?" Lady Agnes stiffened, her teacup rattling against its saucer. "Have some respect, Clara. Collins served this family faithfully for 3 decades. He was more than a butler. He was the backbone of this household." Clara smiled thinly. "Backbones can be stiff, Aunt. Perhaps too stiff." The remark was not lost on Miss Marple, who happened to be present, invited by Lady Agnes for what the older woman called moral steadiness. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes lowering demurely to her saucer. She had learned long ago that when young people mocked the dead, it was rarely out of cruelty alone. It was a deflection, a shield. After breakfast, Inspector Craythorne arrived to renew his questioning. He spoke sternly to the assembled household in the drawing-room. "Until we have clarity, none of you will leave Rosehill grounds. Anyone who attempts to do so will place themselves under grave suspicion." The words were scarcely out of his mouth when Clara let out a laugh. "Grave suspicion? How dramatic. Really, Inspector, you make it sound like a novel." "Perhaps, Miss Farnaby," Craythorne replied coldly, "but unlike novels, this concerns the law, and I shall not have you undermining it." The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Clara's eyes flashed, but she said nothing further. Miss Marple, from her place near the hearth, noticed something small, almost imperceptible: Clara's hands. While she spoke so boldly, her fingers twisted the edge of her handkerchief again and again, until the lace tore. Bold words, trembling hands. That evening, Miss Marple took a quiet walk along the Manor's west corridor, ostensibly to admire the portraits. In truth, she had been troubled by something since the morning. The cabinet where the Siren's locket had been displayed stood near the study, and earlier she had noticed faint smudges not just on the lock but on the wooden floorboards nearby. Now, bending ever so slightly as though admiring the gilt frame of a portrait, she examined them more closely. Wax again. Small droplets hardened into the grain. Yet why would anyone carry a candle here, when the electric lights worked perfectly well? She followed the marks a little way down the corridor until they stopped abruptly outside a narrow side door. When she tried the handle, it was locked. She made a note of it. Secrets often hid not in grand rooms, but in forgotten corners. As she turned to leave, she caught the faintest sound, a whisper or perhaps suppressed sobbing. She paused, head inclined. From the direction of the servants' staircase, light footsteps retreated hurriedly. Miss Marple did not follow. Instead, she returned calmly to her guest chamber. When people wish to hide, she murmured to herself, the kindest thing is to let them think they succeed. At least for the moment. That night the Manor lay hushed once more, but in its silence there was a thrum of unease. Clara paced her bedroom, Lady Agnes sat stern and sleepless, and somewhere in the servants' wing, someone wept softly into their pillow. And Miss Marple, knitting by her lamp, thought of wax strips, trembling hands, and locked doors. Small things, perhaps, but in small things truth was so often revealed. Chapter 8: The Locked Door. The next morning dawned pale and chill, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Inside Rosehill Manor, the atmosphere matched the weather. Gray, heavy, oppressive. The servants moved about uneasily under the inspector's watchful eye, while Clara lounged with studied indifference in the morning room, turning the pages of a magazine she clearly wasn't reading. Miss Marple, however, had risen early. She walked the west corridor again, her steps unhurried, her expression one of mild curiosity, as though she admired the portraits and tapestries for their artistry alone. But her eyes rested once more on the narrow side door. The brass handle gleamed faintly, recently polished. Curious that, in a house of such age, a seldom used door would usually show a film of dust, perhaps a slight squeak when turned. When she approached it this morning, she found, unsurprisingly, that it was still locked. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that locked doors were rarely without purpose. She bent slightly, feigning interest in the carved paneling, and noticed again the tiny specks of wax at the threshold. A candle had burned here, and recently. She straightened and made her way back toward the main hall, where she encountered young Fred Dyer, the gardener. He looked harassed, his cap askew, his hands not quite steady. "Good morning, Fred," Miss Marple said gently. "I trust you are managing despite all the disturbance?" He gave a jerky nod. "Why, yes, ma'am. Inspectors had me questioned twice already." I told him I weren't anywhere near the study. "Of course," Miss Marple said kindly. She tilted her head. "Tell me, Fred, that little side door in the west corridor, does it lead to the gardens?" Fred's face changed. For a moment he seemed about to deny knowledge, then thought better of it. "Aye, ma'am. Leads to the orangery. Hardly used now, but Collins had the key. Always kept it locked." Miss Marple smiled her small, knowing smile. How very practical of him. When she later mentioned the door to Inspector Craythorne, he dismissed it briskly. A servant's passage, nothing more. If Collins had the key, and Collins is dead, then it is of no consequence. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that what the world called of no consequence was often precisely where truth lay hidden. That afternoon, during a lull in the household's movements, she returned quietly to the corridor. This time she carried with her a small knitting needle. It was astonishing what a determined hand could manage with such a simple tool. After a few delicate turns, there came a faint click. The door creaked open an inch. Beyond lay a narrow passage, cool and faintly musty. Dust lay thick on the stone flags, but not everywhere. Along the center, Faint footprints had disturbed the layer, leading inward. Miss Marple did not venture far. She had no wish to be caught prowling, nor to disturb evidence. But she stooped to examine the marks. They were small, narrower than a man's boot, perhaps a woman's shoe. And there, against the wall, she noticed a scrap of paper caught on a rough stone. She eased it free carefully. It was part of a letter, torn and crumpled, the ink blurred but still legible in places. Cannot keep it hidden any longer. You promised. The locket before all is discovered. Miss Marple folded it neatly and slipped it into her knitting bag. Her heart beat a little faster, though outwardly her face remained serene. When she returned to the main corridor, she found Clara standing at the far end, half in shadow, watching her. Clara's eyes narrowed, and for the briefest instant her mask of disdain faltered. Miss Marple inclined her head pleasantly, as though nothing were amiss, and walked calmly away. But in her mind she thought, "Yes, my dear Clara. Secrets rarely stay behind locked doors forever." Chapter 9: A Tangle of Lies. By the following day, Inspector Craythorne was convinced he was closing in. His men had scoured the manor grounds, checked alibis, and pressed the servants with renewed vigor. Yet instead of clarity, contradictions began to creep in, like threads knotted in a tapestry. The cook swore she had been in the kitchen the entire evening of the murder. Yet the scullery maid let slip that the cook had slipped away, for just a moment, to the pantry. The footman claimed to have been asleep, but another servant whispered that she had seen him by the stables, muttering with Fred Dyer. And Fred himself, poor boy, looked wearier by the day, insisting he had gone only for a breath of air, but unable to say precisely when. Miss Marple, who listened with quiet patience to each testimony, observed that no one seemed able to give a simple account of that night. People were always more exact when they had nothing to hide. Inspector Craythorne, however, remained fixed on burglary. "Mark my words, Miss Marple," he told her gruffly over tea in Lady Agnes's drawing room. "This is the work of outsiders. We've had reports of tinkers along the Marleycombe Road. They'd know how to tamper with a lock." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly above her knitting. "Perhaps, Inspector. But would tinkers have written a letter about keeping a locket hidden?" Craythorne frowned. "What's this now?" "Oh," Miss Marple said lightly, as if it were of no consequence. "I merely thought how curious it would be for strangers to know the locket's history." The inspector looked unconvinced. "You've a sharp mind, ma'am, but in my experience, burglary is burglary." Miss Marple did not argue. She had learned long ago that men in authority preferred certainty to doubt. That afternoon Clara was seen in the village, despite the inspector's restrictions. She had slipped past the constable at the gate with airy confidence, declaring she was taking the air. In truth, she went straight to the post office, where Mrs. Weatherby later told half the village that Clara had sent a letter abroad. To France, no less, and in a most agitated state. When Lady Agnes heard of it, she confronted her niece in the great hall, her voice trembling with fury. "Clara, how dare you disobey the inspector? What is this letter you have sent?" Clara tossed her head, though her cheeks burned. "A personal matter, aunt. Nothing to do with you, or your precious butler." Lady Agnes's hand shook as she pointed toward the stairs. "You disgrace this house. Collins gave his life in service to us, and you treat it like a jest. I'll not have it." Clara fled upstairs, slamming her door. The echo rang through the manor like a gunshot. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat with Dolly Bantry in the guest parlor. Dolly was in fine spirits of indignation. "I've no patience with that Clara. Such a horrid temper. She ought to be ashamed, carrying on so. And did you hear, Jane? They say the letter was written in violet ink. Such a frivolous choice in times like these." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Violet ink. Yes. Dolly, I think that may matter more than you realize." Dolly blinked. "Matter? Good heavens, Jane, how could ink color matter?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking. "Because, my dear, ink is like character. It stains, and once chosen, it cannot easily be changed. A letter written in violet might tell us who the writer truly is, and what they fear being revealed." Outside, the rain at last began to fall, tapping softly against the windows of Rosehill Manor. And within its walls, the threads of half-truths and hidden quarrels tangled tighter with every passing hour. Chapter 10. The Violet Letter. The rain continued all through the night, a steady drumming that soaked the fields and left Rosehill's cobbled lanes shining by morning. The village seemed quieter than usual, subdued, as though the storm had washed away its usual chatter. Yet beneath the stillness, rumors moved like underground streams. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby could not contain herself. She repeated to anyone who would listen that Miss Clara Farnaby had indeed sent a letter, written in that queer purple ink of hers, and addressed to some Frenchman with a name I couldn't pronounce. The fact that postal clerks were meant to be discreet did not trouble her conscience in the least. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat by her parlor fire with her knitting on her lap. Before her lay the torn scrap she had found in the orangery passage, smoothed carefully under a paperweight. The ink was faintly tinged violet. The blurred words still read, "Cannot keep it hidden any longer. You promised. The locket." Her eyes softened. Violet ink again. The letter Clara had posted, the torn fragment, 2 threads of the same skein. But the tone was desperate, not flippant. Someone had begged, pleaded. When Lady Agnes invited Miss Marple to the Manor for luncheon that day, Jane carried her knitting bag as always. Conversation at table was strained. Clara was absent, pleading a headache. Inspector Craythorne was present, however, seated squarely at Lady Agnes's right hand, confident as ever. "We've made inquiries with London pawnbrokers," he announced, slicing his beef with satisfaction. "If the locket has been offered, we shall know soon enough. I'm confident the trail leads beyond Rosehill." Lady Agnes inclined her head gravely. "Your diligence is most reassuring, Inspector." Miss Marple quietly buttered a roll. She had no wish to argue, but she had noticed as Craythorne spoke how Lady Agnes's hand trembled slightly against the stem of her glass. Fear, not relief, had flickered across her face. After the meal, Clara reappeared in the drawing-room, pale but defiant. She threw herself into a chair, a cigarette trembling between her fingers. "Aunt," she said suddenly, "you've no right to keep me here like some schoolgirl. If I wish to write letters, I shall. You cannot stop me." Lady Agnes's eyes flashed. "So it was you, then. Clara, what have you written?" "To whom?" Clara exhaled smoke in a thin stream, her lips curling. "Someone who understands more than you, Aunt. Someone who knows what Collins was hiding." The words struck the room like a blow. Lady Agnes paled. The inspector leaned forward sharply. "Hiding? What do you mean, Miss Farnaby?" he demanded. But Clara only laughed bitterly. "Ask your precious servants. Ask your perfect butler. He was no saint, I assure you." Miss Marple's knitting paused for half a second before continuing its rhythm. She remembered the fragment again. "Cannot keep it hidden any longer. The locket. Collins had hidden something, yes. But what? And for whom?" Later that evening, when most of the household had withdrawn, Miss Marple strolled quietly into the library. There, among the ledgers and papers Collins had once kept in meticulous order, she searched gently, not to disturb but to notice. And indeed she noticed one curious thing: an ink bottle nearly empty, its rim stained faintly violet. She lifted it carefully, her eyes thoughtful. Collins, the butler, so exacting, so proper, yet he had used violet ink. The same ink as Clara's letter. The same ink as the torn scrap. Miss Marple set the bottle down, her hands folded serenely. "So," she murmured softly to the empty room, "our poor Collins was keeping secrets too. Secrets that may have been worth a life." Outside, the rain finally ceased, leaving the air heavy with damp earth and the promise of revelations yet to come. Chapter 11. Whispers of the Past. The morning after the storm, Rosehill lay washed and gleaming, its hedgerows dripping silver with rain. Yet inside the manor, the air remained heavy. Servants whispered in corners, Lady Agnes kept mostly to her chamber, and Clara prowled like a restless cat, alternating between fits of silence and bursts of defiance. Miss Marple, however, set out with her basket as though on the most ordinary of errands. She knew well that when tragedy struck, The village itself often spoke as freely as any official witness, if one only listened. At the bakery, Mrs. Elwood leaned across the counter eagerly. "Mark my words, Miss Marple, that locket brought nothing but misfortune. They say Lady Agnes's grandmother received it from a sea captain, and it was cursed from the start. 2 deaths in the family already, and now poor Collins." Miss Marple only smiled kindly, though she filed away the story. Superstitions were rarely reliable, but behind them often lay a kernel of truth. At the vicarage, Mrs. Anstruther proved more practical. Over tea, she lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You'll know, of course, Jane, that the Siren's locket was not merely a trinket. It was said to contain a miniature portrait of a woman no respectable family ever wished mentioned. A certain Italian singer, long ago, who caused quite a scandal among the Farnabys. The story goes that the locket was locked away precisely so it would not embarrass Lady Agnes's branch of the family." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Ah, so not merely silver, but a memory best forgotten." Mrs. Anstruther nodded gravely. "Exactly. And Collins, being the soul of discretion, was tasked with its keeping. But you know as well as I, Jane, secrets have a way of slipping out." That afternoon, Miss Marple walked the village lane with Dolly Bantry, who had been bursting to share her own theory. "I'll wager Clara knew about the singer," Dolly declared. "Why else should she post letters in that ridiculous violet ink? She must be corresponding with some dreadful foreigner, perhaps trying to sell the thing. You mark my words, Jane. Young people are capable of anything." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Young people, Dolly, often think they are doing something quite new, when in truth they are merely repeating the mistakes of the old." Back at the manor, Lady Agnes at last emerged, summoning Miss Marple to her private sitting room. The old lady looked worn, her eyes shadowed, her fingers restless on the arm of her chair. "I cannot sleep, Miss Marple," she confessed. "Collins's death has shaken me more than I can say. But worse, these whispers of letters, of secrets. I fear the past will be dragged into the light, and with it the dignity of my family." Miss Marple reached across gently. "My dear Lady Agnes, families are like gardens. There are weeds in every bed, but if one tends them wisely, they need not choke the flowers." Lady Agnes's eyes glistened. "You are very kind. But Jane, if it is true, if Collins kept that locket hidden because of some scandal, then who could have known? And who would kill for it?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she said softly, "When a secret is old, Lady Agnes, it often seems harmless. But when someone thinks that secret may be used, either to shame or to bargain or to protect, then it becomes dangerous again. Deadly dangerous." As Miss Marple left the sitting room, she glanced toward the west corridor, where the locked door now stood ajar, constables having searched it that morning. She thought of the torn violet letter, of Collins's ink bottle, and of the portrait hidden inside the locket. The past was not merely whispering. It was knocking at Rosehill's door, demanding to be heard. Chapter 12, A Second Shock. The stillness of Rosehill after the storm was short-lived. Barely a day had passed since whispers of the locket scandal had reached every teacup in the village when another event shook the manor. It was Clara who raised the alarm. Her shrill cry rang through the west wing one gray morning, bringing servants running in panic. The small cabinet in Lady Agnes's private sitting room, the one where Collins had long kept the family's heirlooms under lock and key, stood wide open. The little brass lock had been forced. The contents were in disarray. But the Siren's locket was gone. Inspector Craythorne, summoned immediately, blustered about with tape measure and notebook, questioning every footman and maid. But the fact remained plain. Someone in the house had taken it, and taken it boldly. Lady Agnes sat rigid in her chair, her face ashen. "It was Collins's duty to guard it," she murmured. "He gave his life, perhaps, because of it. And now it is gone." Clara, standing at the window, spoke with a strange calm. "Perhaps it was better this way. The thing only brought misery. Whoever has it can keep it." The inspector turned sharply on her. "You seem remarkably indifferent, Miss Farnaby." She shrugged, lighting another cigarette. "Objects are only objects, Inspector. You cannot kill grief by smashing a trinket. Perhaps someone else needed it more than we. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting, watched Clara with thoughtful eyes. Her words were too smooth, her nonchalance just a little too deliberate. Later that afternoon, the village buzzed anew. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby insisted she had seen a tall man in a gray coat lingering near the manor gates the night before. At the bakery, Mr. Elwood swore that his delivery boy had glimpsed Clara speaking to a stranger near the orchard wall. But to Miss Marple, the most telling detail came not from gossip but from observation. As she strolled through the rose garden, she noticed faint mud marks on the path, prints leading toward the west wing windows. Too large for Clara, too heavy for the maids. A man's boots, recently cleaned but not perfectly. When she bent to look more closely, something caught her eye. A small scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn. Dark wool, very fine, with a faint scent of tobacco. That evening, she compared it quietly with the inspector's overcoat when he laid it aside during supper. The weave was not the same. No, this fragment belonged elsewhere. Someone with money enough for good tailoring, but careless enough to brush against a rosebush in haste. At twilight, Miss Marple sat again in her parlor, the scrap folded neatly in her knitting bag. Collins had died guarding a secret. The locket had now been stolen, and somewhere between Clara's violet letters and the muddy footprints lay the truth. The village thought the case near its end. But Jane Marple knew better. Rosehill had not yet seen its darkest hour. Chapter 13. The Stranger in Rosehill. The theft of the locket had scarcely sunk into the village's imagination before Rosehill acquired a new subject of gossip, the appearance of a stranger. He was first seen at the King's Arms Inn, a tall man in his late 40s, with a sharp profile, a graying mustache, and the manner of one accustomed to command. His coat was of fine cut, foreign in style, and his English, though precise, carried the faintest trace of an accent. Mrs. Arkwright, the innkeeper, wasted no time in describing him to her patrons. Calls himself Monsieur Lefebvre. Says he's here on business, though what business a Frenchman has in Rosehill I'd like to know. By the next morning, his name had reached Lady Agnes's ears. She turned pale and sent for Miss Marple at once. "Jane," she whispered, as though the walls might hear, "I feared this would come. That man, Lefebvre, he is connected to the past. Years ago he was a companion to the singer I told you of, the woman in the miniature. If he has come here now, it can only be for the locket." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her needles did not pause. People rarely cross the channel for sentiment, Lady Agnes. If Monsieur Lefebvre has come, it is because he believes the locket still has value. The question is, does he seek its memory, or its market price? Inspector Craythorne, summoned to the inn, confronted Lefebvre directly. "What brings you to Rosehill, sir? You arrive at the very moment a crime is committed. Convenient, don't you think?" Lefebvre raised an eyebrow coolly. "Inspector, I come only for what was promised to me long ago. A token of the past, nothing more. If it is missing, then I am as much wronged as you." Miss Marple, who had accompanied the inspector with polite interest, noticed several details: the faint violet stain on Lefebvre's cuff, the tobacco scent that matched the scrap in her knitting bag, and the way his eyes flickered ever so slightly when Clara's name was mentioned. Later, walking through the village green, Jane encountered Clara herself in whispered conversation with the Frenchman beneath the chestnut trees. Clara's face was flushed, her gestures urgent. Lefebvre leaned close, his tone low but intense. When Clara saw Miss Marple approaching, she started violently and turned away, muttering something about needing air. Lefebvre merely tipped his hat, his gaze unreadable. That evening, Dolly Bantry came bustling in to Miss Marple's cottage, brimming with excitement. "Jane, you'll never guess. That Frenchman. He was asking after Collins in the taproom last night. Wanted to know where the butler kept his accounts, of all things. Isn't that odd?" Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. "Not odd at all, Dolly. If Monsieur Lefebvre believed Collins held the key to the locket, or its secret, he would want to know everything about him. Yes, everything." Outside, the dusk deepened. Somewhere in Rosehill, the stolen locket lay hidden, passing from hand to hand like a shadow. But Miss Marple's eyes, gentle and wise, were beginning to see the outline of the truth. Chapter 14. The Web Titans. Rosehill was no longer peaceful. The villagers, who once gossiped idly over scones and seed catalogues, now whispered in hushed tones of murder, theft, and foreigners. Every glance carried suspicion. Every footstep on the cobbles made heads turn. At Rosehill Manor, the atmosphere grew strained to breaking point. Lady Agnes, once so stately, now paced her drawing room restlessly, her hands twisting her handkerchief to threads. Clara moved about the house with brittle defiance, yet shadows marked her eyes. And through it all, Inspector Craythorne busied himself with endless questions, convinced that Monsieur Lefebvre was the villain. Miss Marple saw matters differently. She had observed Clara's trembling hand when Lefebvre was mentioned, the too eager flush on her cheeks when she denied knowing him well. She had noted, too, Lady Agnes's sudden silences whenever her late sister was mentioned. The singer scandal seemed more deeply tied to the family than Lady Agnes wished to admit. One evening, Miss Marple found herself once more in the Manor's library, quietly reviewing Collins's ledgers. Amidst the careful records of household expenses, she noticed a peculiar entry repeated over the years. Custody, special item, cleaned and sealed. No description, only a date, always in Collins's hand, always marked in violet ink. She replaced the ledger gently, her eyes soft with thought. Collins had not merely guarded the locket. He had tended it, cared for it. Why? Unless its contents, the miniature, held some truth he alone understood. The next day, Monsieur Lefebvre sought Clara openly on the village green. Their voices carried further than they intended. "You promised," he hissed, his accent sharper under strain. "Without the locket, I have nothing. You swore you could deliver it to me." Clara's voice quivered. "I tried, but it was Collins. He knew. He always knew. And now he's dead." Miss Marple, strolling past with her basket of knitting wool, pretended not to hear. But her ears, like her eyes, missed nothing. That night, Lady Agnes summoned Clara to her room. The old lady's voice was low but fierce. "Clara, tell me the truth. Did you know this Lefebvre before he came here? Did you write to him?" Clara turned her face away. He knew my mother." The silence that followed was heavy as thunder. Lady Agnes's hand trembled against the chair. "Your mother, Clara. Do you mean?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "My mother was the singer. The one you tried so hard to forget. And the locket, the portrait inside it, it was hers." The words cracked the house in two. Lady Agnes covered her face with her hand. Clara stood rigid, defiant yet broken. And in the shadows outside the door, Miss Marple, who had been quietly approaching with her knitting bag, paused. She did not intrude. She did not need to. For she now understood Clara's defiance, Lady Agnes's fear, Lefebvre's desperation. They were bound together not only by murder, but by blood, memory, and shame. The web was tightening. And somewhere in its heart lay the truth about who had killed Collins. And why? Sparkles Chapter 14 reveals. Collins's ledgers show regular care of the locket, in violet ink. Clara and Lefebvre's whispered quarrel proves they conspired. Clara reveals her mother was the singer. The scandal Lady Agnes hid. The locket is not just an heirloom, it is proof of Clara's true parentage. Backhand index pointing right. Do you want me to continue into Chapter 15, Shadows at Midnight, where danger strikes again and Miss Marple draws nearer to the killer? Or pause here and sketch the plan for 15 to 18 before I write? You said. Yes. ChatGPT said. Wonderful. Okay, hand, let's continue with Chapter 15, Shadows at Midnight, where the danger grows sharper. Miss Marple and Murder in the Siren's Locket. Chapter 15, Shadows at Midnight. The manor seemed different by night. Its tall windows loomed like watchful eyes. Its corridors whispered with drafts and echoes. To those who lived within, the house no longer felt safe. That night, Clara could not sleep. She drifted through the west wing in her dressing gown, cigarette glowing faintly between her fingers. At every creak of the floorboards she started. At every shadow she turned sharply. For she had begun to receive notes, slipped beneath her door and signed. The first had read simply, "You know more than you say." The second, "The truth will ruin you." And now the third lay in her trembling hand. "Meet me by the orchard wall, midnight." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had noticed Clara's growing agitation. She had observed the girl's pallor, the restless glances, the nervous way she crushed her cigarettes half-smoked. So it was that, when the house settled to sleep, Jane herself sat quietly in a chair by the parlor window, shawl around her shoulders, waiting. At 11:30, she saw Clara slip across the lawn, pale as a ghost under the moonlight, toward the orchard wall. And in the shadows beyond, a figure waited. Miss Marple rose, quietly took her umbrella, and followed. The orchard lay silver under the moon, its branches dripping with dew. Clara approached the wall, her voice low, uncertain. "I've come. What do you want from me?" A man's voice answered, sharp and urgent. "The locket. You had it, or you knew where Collins kept it. Do not play games, Clara. Without it, we are both finished." It was Lefebvre. Clara's hand shook. "I swear I don't have it. Someone else took it. Perhaps the inspector, perhaps." Her words broke off in a gasp. From the shadows stepped a second figure, moving swiftly, silently. A gloved hand reached out, toward Clara's throat. Miss Marple struck first. With surprising swiftness, she swung her umbrella against the attacker's arm. The figure recoiled with a muffled cry, retreating into the trees before Clara could even scream. Lefebvre seized Clara's arm. "Foolish girl. You bring danger on us both." But his face was white, his own hands trembling. Miss Marple stepped forward calmly, her shawl drawn tight. "That will do, Monsieur Lefebvre. The young lady is in no further need of your protection." He dropped Clara's arm at once, muttering something in French too low to catch. Then, with a stiff bow, he vanished into the night. Clara clung to Miss Marple, trembling. "He was trying to kill me." "No, my dear," Jane said gently, guiding her back toward the house. "Not Monsieur Lefebvre. He is desperate, yes, but not murderous tonight. That second figure, whoever it was, meant to silence you. Which means you know more than you realize." As the manor doors closed behind them, Miss Marple's face, serene as ever, betrayed the weight of her thoughts. For she now knew the truth was not only about scandal or shame. It was about survival. Someone inside Rosehill Manor feared Clara's voice so much they were willing to kill her too. And the circle of suspects had just grown smaller. Chapter 15: Shadows at Midnight. The manor seemed different by night. Its tall windows loomed like watchful eyes. Its corridors whispered with drafts and echoes. To those who lived within, the house no longer felt safe. That night, Clara could not sleep. She drifted through the west wing in her dressing gown, cigarette glowing faintly between her fingers. At every creak of the floorboards she started. At every shadow she turned sharply. For she had begun to receive notes, slipped beneath her door and signed. The first had read simply, "You know more than you say." The second, "The truth will ruin you." And now the third lay in her trembling hand. "Meet me by the orchard wall, midnight." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had noticed Clara's growing agitation. She had observed the girl's pallor, the restless glances, the nervous way she crushed her cigarettes half-smoked. So it was that, when the house settled to sleep, Jane herself sat quietly in a chair by the parlor window, shawl around her shoulders, waiting. At 11:30, she saw Clara slip across the lawn, pale as a ghost under the moonlight, toward the orchard wall. And in the shadows beyond, a figure waited. Miss Marple rose, quietly took her umbrella, and followed. The orchard lay silver under the moon, its branches dripping with dew. Clara approached the wall, her voice low, uncertain. "I've come. What do you want from me?" A man's voice answered, sharp and urgent. "The locket. You had it, or you knew where Collins kept it. Do not play games, Clara. Without it, we are both finished." It was Lefebvre. Clara's hand shook. "I swear I don't have it. Someone else took it. Perhaps the inspector, perhaps." Her words broke off in a gasp. From the shadows stepped a second figure, moving swiftly, silently. A gloved hand reached out, toward Clara's throat. Miss Marple struck first. With surprising swiftness, She swung her umbrella against the attacker's arm. The figure recoiled with a muffled cry, retreating into the trees before Clara could even scream. Lefebvre seized Clara's arm. "Foolish girl. You bring danger on us both." But his face was white, his own hands trembling. Miss Marple stepped forward calmly, her shawl drawn tight. "That will do, Monsieur Lefebvre. The young lady is in no further need of your protection." He dropped Clara's arm at once, muttering something in French too low to catch. Then, with a stiff bow, he vanished into the night. Clara clung to Miss Marple, trembling. "He was trying to kill me." "No, my dear," Jane said gently, guiding her back toward the house. "Not Monsieur Lefebvre. He is desperate, yes, but not murderous tonight. That second figure, whoever it was, meant to silence you, which means you know more than you realize." As the manor doors closed behind them, Miss Marple's face, serene as ever, betrayed the weight of her thoughts. For she now knew the truth was not only about scandal or shame. It was about survival. Someone inside Rosehill Manor feared Clara's voice so much they were willing to kill her too. And the circle of suspects had just grown smaller. Chapter 16. The trap is set. The events in the orchard changed everything. The villagers had suspected, whispered, and speculated. But now it was clear. Clara was in danger. Someone within Rosehill Manor feared her knowledge enough to strike at her life. Inspector Craythorne, furious at the intrusion of an unknown assailant, thundered about the grounds with constables, vowing to post guards at every door. Yet Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, knew this was useless. A killer who had walked the halls once could do so again, no matter the locks or watchmen. The solution, she reflected, was not to bar the windows, but to open them, to let the moth fly to the flame of its own accord. That morning, she paid a visit to Dolly Bantry. Over a pot of tea, she spoke in her mildest tone. "Dolly, you have always been such a dear help in matters of observation. Might you, quite by chance, spread a little word in the village? Nothing too obvious, only that Clara has discovered where the locket is hidden, that she means to reveal it very soon." Dolly's eyes widened. "Why, Jane? You don't mean, oh, I see. You want to tempt the creature out of its hole." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Exactly, my dear. Temptation is a stronger snare than any police cordon. If the locket is indeed the key, then the one who fears its discovery will not rest until it is silenced, or recovered." Within hours, the whisper had spread like smoke. At the inn, Mrs. Arkwright repeated it with relish. At the bakery, Mrs. Elwood nodded knowingly. And by supper, Clara herself had heard it from a maid, her eyes widening with fear. That night, Miss Marple sat in the manor library, ostensibly absorbed in her knitting. But her ears were tuned to every creak, her eyes to every shadow. She had arranged for Clara to retire early, her candle left burning in the bedroom window, a sign to any watcher that she was alone. Near midnight, the trap sprang. A figure moved stealthily down the west wing corridor, pausing outside Clara's room. A hand reached for the latch. But when the door opened, it revealed not a frightened girl but Inspector Craythorne himself, sitting in a chair with his revolver drawn. The intruder froze. Miss Marple stepped forward from the shadows, her shawl wrapped close. "I thought it might be you," she said softly. The figure turned, eyes blazing with fury. It was not Lefebvre. Nor was it Clara. It was someone far closer, someone the household trusted. Miss Marple's voice, calm and steady, carried across the silence. "You may put down the poker now, my dear. Violence will not serve you. The truth always does come out, sooner or later." The intruder's hand trembled. For the first time, the mask slipped, and the real killer of Collins stood revealed. Chapter 17. The Face of the Killer. The library lamps burned low, casting long shadows across the oak panels. The figure at Clara's door froze in the sudden confrontation, caught between Inspector Craythorne's revolver and Miss Marple's quiet, steady gaze. Slowly, the intruder lowered the poker, and as the light fell across their face, Clara gasped from behind Miss Marple. It was Mr. Redmayne, Lady Agnes's steward. For years he had managed the family's accounts, a man of quiet efficiency, never raising suspicion. But now his face was twisted with anger, his eyes glittering. Inspector Craythorne barked, "Redmayne! By heaven, I should have guessed." But Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost sorrowful. "Oh no, Inspector. You did not guess because Redmayne seemed so useful, so reliable. That is why Collins trusted him too much." Redmayne gave a bitter laugh. "Trusted? He spied on me. He knew I had found the locket. He meant to expose me to Lady Agnes. And so—" His words faltered. Miss Marple nodded gently. "And so you killed him. Poor Collins, who only wished to keep the family's dignity intact. You silenced him to keep the locket for yourself." Lady Agnes, summoned by the commotion, entered at that moment, her face stricken. "Redmayne! You! After all these years!" He turned on her fiercely. "Yes, my lady. After years of service, of watching you hoard treasures you did not deserve, I took what should have been mine. The locket was worth a fortune, on the black market, perhaps more than your precious estate." Miss Marple's eyes, kind yet unflinching, held his. Not only for its silver, but for the portrait inside. A secret others might pay dearly to possess, or to suppress. That was your true prize, was it not? Redmayne's silence was answer enough. Clara's voice trembled. "But why try to kill me? I had nothing." Miss Marple laid a hand gently on her arm. "You had everything, my dear. You bore the likeness of your mother, the woman in the miniature. Redmayne feared that once the portrait was revealed, you would be recognized, your claim undeniable. Then his bargaining power would vanish." Redmayne lunged as though to speak again, but Craythorne's men seized him, wrenching the poker from his grasp. He was led away, cursing under his breath, his dignity gone. The room fell into silence. Clara wept softly into her handkerchief. Lady Agnes sank into her chair, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple, drawing her shawl about her, spoke gently. "Secrets, like weeds, cannot be buried forever. They grow, they twist, and in the end they choke what is fair. Collins knew this. He gave his life guarding a memory, but in the end it was not memory that killed him, it was greed." Outside, the manor clock struck midnight. The house, for the first time in weeks, seemed to exhale. Yet Miss Marple knew that though the killer was caught, the consequences of the truth had only begun. Chapter 18. The Truth of the Locket. Morning broke over Rosehill with a thin veil of mist. News of Redmayne's arrest spread swiftly through the village. By noon, every teacup rattled with the tale. Collins murdered, the steward unmasked, the locket at the heart of it all. Yet still, questions remained. Lady Agnes summoned Miss Marple to her private sitting room. The old lady's hands trembled as she held out the recovered locket, retrieved from Redmayne's desk after his arrest. Its silver was tarnished, the hinges stiff with age, but within lay the secret that had driven men to crime. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Inside was the miniature, painted in delicate strokes, fading but still clear. A dark-haired woman with luminous eyes, her beauty vivid even through the years. Clara drew in her breath sharply. "My mother." Lady Agnes's face hardened, then softened. "Yes, child. Your mother, my sister. She chose the stage, the life of a singer, instead of the respectability we were raised to. I sought to protect you from her legacy. Collins was my ally in that. He locked the locket away, kept it hidden so that you might grow without shame." Clara's eyes shone with defiance and pain. "Without shame? Or without truth? You meant to erase her. To erase me." Miss Marple closed the locket gently, folding her hands upon it. "Forgive me, Lady Agnes, but truth has a way of persisting. One cannot blot out a person's existence as one crosses out a line in a ledger. Clara is her mother's daughter, but she is also herself. Young, intelligent, strong. The past may shape us, but it does not wholly define us." Inspector Craythorne, hovering with impatience, interrupted. "Very moving, I'm sure. But it was greed, not family, that drove Redmayne. Had the locket been worth nothing, Collins would still be alive." Miss Marple shook her head softly. "Not quite, Inspector. Redmayne's greed found its fuel in secrecy. If Lady Agnes had not feared scandal, If Clara had known her history, there would have been nothing to bargain with, nothing to sell. It is silence, not scandal, that gave the locket its value. Lady Agnes's eyes filled with tears. I only wished to shield her, to shield us all. Jane Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle as a lullaby. And in so doing, my dear, you allowed a secret to fester. Secrets, when left too long, draw those who would exploit them. Collins understood that. He tried to guard it. But it was too late. There was silence then. Clara touched the locket, her fingers brushing the miniature. She was beautiful. And if she made mistakes, they were hers. I would rather know the truth, however painful, than live in shadows. Lady Agnes bowed her head. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I should have told you. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. The past cannot be rewritten, Lady Agnes. But the future? Ah, that is still yours to guide. The mist outside lifted, revealing the bright fields of Rosehill. Within the manor, however, the air was heavy still. Collins lay in his grave, Redmayne awaited trial, and Clara stood at the threshold of her own truth. And Miss Marple, serene as ever, knew there was one last step before the village could return to peace. The final telling, when all the threads must be tied and the pattern revealed. Chapter 19. Miss Marple Explains. The drawing-room of Rosehill Manor was filled to the brim. Villagers, household staff, and the inspector's men had crowded in at Lady Agnes's request. Outside, the September sun poured through tall windows, brightening the polished furniture and long curtains. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. She had been persuaded, though she would not have called it persuasion, that the truth must be told openly, so that the village might rest and speculation cease. Inspector Craythorne, standing squarely by the hearth, cleared his throat. Miss Marple has requested a word, and since she seems to have understood what many of us missed, I have agreed. A ripple of anticipation passed through the room. Gossip and speculation had already reached fever pitch in Rosehill. Now every ear leaned forward. Miss Marple began softly, almost conversationally. You see, my dears, it was all rather simple once one stopped looking for something clever. Murder rarely springs from grand design. It arises from the ordinary weaknesses of human nature. Envy, greed, pride. And in this case, all three. She looked toward Lady Agnes, who sat stiffly, her hands clasped. Lady Agnes sought to keep her sister's memory buried, believing secrecy safer than truth. Mr. Collins, loyal to the last, kept her confidence and guarded the locket. But secrecy breeds danger. Someone else, Mr. Redmayne, saw opportunity. Gasps came from the household staff. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Mr. Redmayne was a man who handled the family's accounts, who knew how to find worth where others saw trinkets. He discovered the locket. He learned its story. And when Collins grew suspicious, Redmayne silenced him. Not in haste, but with calculation. Craythorne nodded grimly. Poison, administered in small doses, until the final night. Just so, Miss Marple said. But what he had not reckoned upon was human likeness. When he saw young Clara, he realized her face mirrored the miniature. That resemblance made her dangerous to him. For if the portrait were ever revealed, Clara's claim to heritage, and the scandal it might provoke, would outweigh any price he could fetch on the market. Clara flushed but held her head high. And so, Miss Marple went on, he sought to frighten her, perhaps even to harm her. That was his undoing, for criminals so often betray themselves when fear drives them into rashness. His appearance at Clara's door, poker in hand, revealed what had been hidden. The room was silent, every face intent. Miss Marple folded her hands. And thus we see how murder often springs not from strangers, but from those nearest to us. Redmayne was trusted, quiet, reliable, the very qualities that masked his ambition. Collins died because he was loyal. Redmayne fell because he was greedy. And Lady Agnes, forgive me, bears some blame, for secrets, like dust, always seep through cracks. They cling, they gather, and in the end, they choke. For a long moment no one spoke. The truth settled over the room like dust in a sunbeam. Slow, inevitable, impossible to brush away. Then Inspector Craythorne gave a brisk nod. "Well, the jury will decide his fate, but I've no doubt they'll agree. Miss Marple, you've done us a great service." The villagers began to murmur, half in awe, half in gossip renewed. Clara reached for Miss Marple's hand, tears bright in her eyes. "You've given me back my mother," she whispered. Miss Marple smiled, a small, kind smile. "No, my dear. You gave her back to yourself. I only turned over the stone that hid her." And with that, she picked up her knitting once more, as though the business of murder and secrets were no more than a passing storm on a summer's day. Chapter 20. Aftermath in Rosehill. The days following Redmayne's arrest passed with a strange quietness. Rosehill, so often content with its rhythms of church bells, market chatter, and the clatter of teacups, found itself unsettled. The very air seemed thinner, as though the village had exhaled too deeply and forgotten how to breathe again. At the post office, Mrs. Finch whispered over letters that never quite reached their envelopes. At the grocer's, customers lingered longer than they ought, spinning theories though they knew the truth had already been told. And in the snug of the Rosehill Arms, old Mr. Pritchard insisted to anyone who'd listen that he had always suspected Redmayne, though in truth, he had once praised him as the only honest fellow left in the county. But beneath the gossip lay a deeper unease. The villagers had trusted Redmayne. They had spoken kindly of him, let him handle accounts, seen him at church. To know that such a man could harbor murder in his heart shook their sense of safety. Lady Agnes withdrew into her manor, the shutters half closed, visitors refused. Some pitied her. Others muttered she had brought it on herself with her pride and secrecy. Only Clara was seen about the village, her chin lifted though her eyes still carried the shadow of grief. Children stared, half in curiosity, half in awe, for the story of her hidden parentage had already spread. Miss Marple, in her quiet cottage at the edge of the green, carried on with her knitting and her garden. Neighbors brought her flowers, cakes, even a bottle of sherry, each gift accompanied by a whisper of thanks. She accepted it all with modest surprise, though inwardly she reflected, as she often did, that people always admired the solving of mysteries, while seldom learning the lesson they taught. One afternoon, as she watered her roses, Clara came walking up the lane. She paused at the gate, her face pale but composed. "I wanted to thank you again," she said softly. "Not just for unmasking him, but for giving me back a story that was mine all along." Miss Marple looked at her with fond eyes. "My dear, stories are curious things. They can be buried, forgotten, even rewritten, but they always find their way back to those who need them." Clara's gaze lingered on the garden, where the roses bloomed rich and fragrant. "Do you think people will ever forget?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Forget? No, but they will fold it into the fabric of the village, as they do with everything. One day, Redmayne will be spoken of as just another cautionary tale, like the floods or the fire at the mill. People will cluck their tongues, shake their heads, and then discuss the weather." Clara gave a small smile. "Perhaps that's a kind of peace." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Indeed, my dear. Peace comes not from silence, but from knowing. And you know the truth now. That is more than many people are granted." As Clara walked away, Miss Marple returned to her roses. The afternoon sun warmed her shoulders, and she thought to herself how curious it was that life could resume its rhythm so swiftly, even after death and secrets had torn it apart. Yet she also knew that scars remained. Rosehill would never be quite the same again, and perhaps she thought that was for the best.